Sons of Devils by Alex R. Oliver. Chapter 2, in which the Archmage of Istanbul is at a loss. Zeyd thought the jellyfish tried to skirt his fingers, but he was too fast for them. When pinched between finger and thumb, they felt a little like cold sliced chicken, the same yielding firmness as that of muscle. But if so, it was muscle made of glass, for he could see perfectly from one side to the next. Sometimes the fluttering edge of one would pull itself out of his grasp, and he would know the thing was alive, aware of him in some way. The Bosphorus was full of them, drifting like flowers made of evanescent light. They seemed to have no eyes, no brain, unless the central tangle of pink fleshy stuff contained both. Contained their hearts too, and their mouths. Yet they were conscious somehow, else how would they know to try and avoid his fingers? He scooped up a netful. Out of the water they seemed even less alive, unable to support their own weight, flattened into discs of mucus as if spat out onto the harbour's roads. He transferred them to a bucket of seawater, where they billowed out once more into their true shapes. Here, when examined at close quarters, they appeared less luminous, more simply pale, disappointing. Zeyd Effendi, what under the heavens are you doing? The boat's owner, tiller in one hand, loose end of the sail in the other, nudged the bucket with his bare foot. Settling back on his haunches, Zeyd considered the question. He must indeed look very foolish. "It is surely a creature of uncanny abilities," he said, at last, ignoring the ferryman's sceptical smile. "They are aware, and they generate a faint light. I intend to discover if it is like an ink, like the ink of octopuses, which is not at all magical, or if it is something more marvellous and rare." The ferryman pushed 2 fingers under his cap and scratched his head. "You wanted it for your charms." Zeyd was impressed. Though charms and magic were not strictly accurate, this was a science based upon the principles of the ancient Atlanteans. The words were useful enough to allow. "That's right," he said. "Would it not be better to write charms against the darkness of the evil one, using ink that is itself brimming with magical light?" I'm sorry I see so many people, did you? My nephew came to see you, this time last year, for a word that would keep the cats from our storeroom." Zeyd smiled and wondered if he should ask, did it work? But he had found that putting a question in his clients' minds about the efficacies of the remedies often led to them failing. Faith clearly played an element in the working of science, which was understandable enough. It played a role in everything else. Nor was there any real reason to doubt the charm's efficacy. He might have no talent himself, a fact he kept as carefully hidden as the truth that it was in fact his mother's blessing which lay on the parchment squares. But he had copied out the formula exactly from the books of many well-regarded sages. If it worked for them, there was no reason to doubt it would work for him too. "Nevzat ibn Ahmed," he said instead. "I remember him. He paid in anchovies. My family dined well that night." "It would be pretty, at least," said the old sailor. "If you could write in a blue like that, so pale you would think it was burning salt." "It would," Zeyd agreed. He would have to take the bucket home and spend the hours he needed to cut up the creatures, to find out if the colours could be harvested. If the operation itself required magic, his mother and his aunt might be needed to help. "Well, I think no more will fit in here, so I am done." But the ferryman was no longer attending him. "What?" he exclaimed under his breath, catching the wind in his sail, slewing round the tiny boat so he could see more clearly. Following the line of the old man's gaze, Zeyd watched a ship sail round Seraglio Point. It came surging up through the black water, over the floating white blooms of the jellyfish, throwing plumes of white foam to either side of its blind prow. Its hull was black and eyeless, except for the impious carving of a half-naked woman on its bow. People who could put such a thing as decoration on their ship must have no respect either for women or for themselves. Behind the painted houri, the shape of the tarred hull swept back in bulbous lines. A row of cannon protruded their open mouths from gun ports visible in the sides, and a second row bristled above them. Above the silvery decks, the yards of the ship were festooned with men, and the full spread of white sail that drove her fast into Istanbul harbour was efficiently being taken up and bound in long cords. Infidels, thought Zeyd uneasily. French or English or Dutch, perhaps, whose newly sprung cultures had barely wiped off the blood of the Crusades before they were back, trying to spread their devilry to the civilized world. What could they want here with a battleship? The ship dropped its anchor, drifted to a gentle halt just inside the hook of the straits, halfway between Topkapi and the Mosque of Suleiman. Zeyd and his boat were just a little further in, due south of the Galata Tower. A little distant man in a tight blue coat and a hat that gleamed with gold leaned over the side and beckoned to him, shouting something that was probably not as unmannerly as it sounded, in his language that was like the muttering of icy gin in the distant north. Reluctantly, Zeyd stood up straight, brushed down his kaftan and kebken, and yelled back, "I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying." A second man joined the first by the rail, this one half naked and apparently completely unconcerned by the fact. He had the olive colouring and clever eyes of a Greek. He said, "We, British ship Inconstant, want to talk." Zeyd Effendi. His ferryman interrupted him with a fierce nod to the shore. "Kneel, the Sultan comes." Pushing off from their landings in the grounds of the palace came the 5 kikes that formed the honour guard of the Sultan. Ahead of them, the golden oars of the Sultan's kike beat like falcon wings. As always at this hour, the Lord of the Horizons was going to prayer at the Suleymaniye. 40 oarsmen dressed in white sped his sacred person over the black waters of the Bosphorus in a white kike that flew like an arrow. Its snowy sides were striped with green like a billion emeralds. The Sultan himself sat on a golden chair at the stern and trusted that no one would dare to look straight at his magnificence. Instead, behind him, but ahead of the 4 guard boats, there came a second kike just a little less grand, with the imperial standard-bearer in the seat of honour, carrying the Sultan's turban. It was to the turban that Zeyd bowed, the Sultan himself being too numinous to look upon, except as if by accident from the corner of his eye. All the movement of the harbour ceased, as men in the boats and on the shore bowed down to the symbol of the shadow of God on earth. A hush fell as if over all the world. In that hush, there came a grumbling of wooden wheels and a faint hiss, and then, treacherously, unthinkably, the British ship opened fire. Her whole dark side erupted in tongues of flame and plumes of white smoke. A moment later, and her thunder roared across the peaceful harbour. Boys crabbing from the harbour walls screamed and fell. Fishermen jumped overboard to safety, or cowered, covering their heads to protect them from the rain of fiery debris. Ashes and sparks floated on the wind. Zeyd's heart stopped beating. His mind went perfectly blank for a long moment, waiting for the cannonballs to smash into the little fleet of kikes, tear them into splinters and rags of flesh. As he waited, the guns trundled back. They fired again, flame and noise, and this time a wad of burning fabric the size of a clenched fist burst from one, struck the imperial turban, set it alight, and knocked it into the waves. He watched it unravel beneath the water into a long white ribbon, the diamonds in its sarpesh twinkling forlornly as they sank. All of a sudden his desire to point out that the cannons had not been loaded, that it had clearly been meant as a salute of honour, didn't seem to matter at all. When the Sultan stood up in the stern of his kite, drew his scimitar and declared war, Zeyd joined in with the cheering with all the fervour of fear and outrage combined. Accidental or not, such an insult could not be borne without consequences. Zeyd was torn between a desire to stay and watch what happened next, and a desire to get out of a harbour rapidly filling up with armed warships as Istanbul's navy mobilised to chase off the threat. The ferryman's priorities, however, were clear. He whipped the sail around, braced himself against the tiller, and raced before the wind straight up the estuary, out of the potential conflict, into the Golden Horn. When he landed, Zeyd was but an hour's walk from home. Zeyd was glad enough of the man's discretion to give him twice the agreed fee, and to ask him to come back next week to repeat the trip. Hefting his bucket of jellyfish by the rope handles, Zeyd began to walk uphill, through the narrow but prosperous streets of his neighbourhood. Zeyd made it a slow journey, stopping at his barber's, the front of the baths, the storyteller's niche in the marketplace, and at the house of the Bektashi order, to tell everyone he knew that war had come, bringing risk and spoils and triumph, new slaves, new lands, new converts for a city that had perhaps become a little staid. At the baker's counter he stopped again, set down his burden and waited. A towel had been flung over the bread and cakes, and the baker's chair was empty, but a small blue glass cup of tea sat on the stones beside it, still steaming. Clearly he was due back at any moment. Hearing voices, Zeyd slid his bucket under one of the cloths and went round to investigate. And there was the shopkeeper, leaning against the pierced stonework window of a rich merchant's house, exchanging the time of day with the beggar whose pitch this had been since Zeyd had first ventured into the world as a nervous schoolboy of 7 years old. "Peace be upon you," he said to them both, and was struck by the irony of it. "But perhaps I shouldn't say that, for I've come to tell you that we are at war." "No." The baker had flour smudges all over his loosely wrapped turban, and smears of bright saffron on the apron tied over his white, wide trousers. The saffron went nicely with the bright green of his sash, but drew attention to his odd, ill-omened bluish eyes. His life seemed to have been spent making up for the evil eyes nature had bestowed on him. Here he was, delivering freshly baked flatbread to his local beggar, and pausing for a chat. The beggar leaned back on his wheeled platform, contemplated the stumps of his legs with a grin, and did not trouble to look anything but pleased that war had left him behind a long time ago. "I saw it myself in the harbour, a treacherous attack on the Sultan by—" Zeyd stopped himself. That wasn't true, was it? Whatever he felt about the indignity, about the humiliation, it was true that what had happened had been an attempt to give honour, an attempt that had gone disastrously wrong. Actually, perhaps I am premature. The Sultan declared war on the British, but perhaps when he has had time to think, he will realise that the insult done on him was by accident. Perhaps, with a clearer head, he will only demand apologies. "You've left half of the story out, and what you've included makes little sense without it," the beggar pointed out. He patted the street beside him with a hand gnarled and calloused as a foot. "Have a seat and tell us the whole story." So Zeyd did. Halfway through, a tea seller joined them, and they brought sweet, refreshing tea poured through stalks of mint. The baker ducked back to his stall to bring out a plate of cheese borek, the smell of which drew his neighbour, the fishmonger, to flip a cover over his own stall and take a moment's rest in the shade to hear the news. "We will have the regiments gathering then," he observed with enthusiasm. Lots of new mouths to feed. Perhaps even Christian troops from the provinces, all of whom eat fish on Fridays. Christian troops mean a harbour full of drunkards, said the tea seller with disdain. Fights in the streets. Sailors knocking down anything they think is heretical. Looking at things with those cat eyes of theirs. He smiled apologetically to the baker. I mean no offence to you, Effendi. Despite the caveats, everyone seemed cautiously pleased. Zeyd had been too at first. After a long period when this, the mightiest empire on earth, beloved of Allah, had seemed sunk into soft indolence, it was rallying to hear the war drums, to think of the horsetail standards streaming out over barbarian lands. But when patriotism ebbed, he found he was left with worry. They have a fine navy, the British, so I've heard. I'm only glad we do not live further out toward the sea. I read that their guns can hit targets a mile away. How do you defend yourself from that? War, no matter how it stirred the blood, had changed drastically since the days of Osman. War on the sea was their enemy's strength. We have a fine navy too. The baker took back the now empty basket of bread from the beggar's hands, tucked it under his elbow on top of the empty platter of borek. The world trembles at the thunder of our horses' hooves, and I, for one, am glad that we are taking the faith to one more lost nation. God is with us. What need do we have for anything else? God is with us, Zeyd agreed, though Allah was just, and how just would it be to go to war because of a mistake? The impromptu picnic broke up, and he waved farewell to the beggar. Following the baker back to his shop, he bought a dozen bitter almond biscuits. The sort your mother likes. Yes. She's well? Zeyd smiled, though he wondered what she would make of this news. As always. I know she would like a proper house, but she doesn't complain. Too busy finding you a wife, eh? The baker wrapped the biscuits in a layer of paper and then in a linen cloth. It was a shame to stuff such a pretty parcel into his sash, but Zeyd needed both hands for the bucket. He grimaced. A house would go a long way to helping with that too. There are not too many fathers who would happily see their daughter moved into a mausoleum. Pah! You are a holy man. You are a catch for some pious family. Or you will be once you're old enough to look the part. And too old to enjoy a wife. Zeyd fumbled for his coins, but the baker waved the payment off. Your sad tale has moved my heart, he laughed. Take the only piece of sweetness I can offer with my blessings. Surely you are in more need of it than I. After which there was nothing left except the steep climb through higher levels of the city, where the paving gave way to dusty soil, and out once more into the slopes of the cemetery of Ayyub. The mosque of the Prophet's follower stood up domed and familiar against a sky that had begun to glow with the deeper colours of early evening. Not so grand as the Suleymaniye, or so perfect as the Hagia Sophia, which gleamed and twinkled in the distance further out toward the harbour mouth, but holier than both, and modest with it. The mosque was not where he was headed. Instead, he wound his way through the cypresses and small white walls that shaded the swell of the graveyard. He knew the headstones by heart, the flowing inscriptions, the knobs of carved turbans on top, denoting the dead man's status in life. A particularly lovely mimosa tangled above the slightly larger stone tomb of one Ibn Nasim, who had been a poet in life. Zeyd paused there to ease his aching arms and look down over the beauty of the greatest city in the world. Evening's humidity was beginning to draw scents from the flowering plants that grew in profusion among the graves, and the cicadas picked up urgency again after being lulled to sleep in the midday sun. He left the poet behind and turned down a paved lane of grander tombs. Some nothing more than a single room with the catafalque immediately within, some with 1 or 2 antechambers. Most of these had regular living inhabitants, Zeyd's neighbours and peers. The poor, as well as those who had retired to a simpler life, to think about God away from the city bustle. Zeyd's father had left him something a little better. He reached the end of the quiet street of the dead, and there was the mausoleum of Dede Abdul Khalik, his home. The saint in life had been a friend of the angel Gabriel. He had cured illnesses both by touch and by his word, and had set his neighbour's problems before the angel, relaying the supernatural wisdom back. Once he had only been one of the hermits, but by the time he died he was so well known, so beloved, that the people he had touched in life built him this splendid complex, the great hall in which his catafalque lay, and 5 chambers beyond, with windows of pierced stonework and coloured glass. Enough for an office for Zeyd, and separate small quarters for his women, decently shuttered and retired from anyone who might come to seek his help. With some relief, he pushed open the wrought iron gate that closed the entrance to the tomb, and set his jellyfish inside in the cool. He couldn't quite tell if they were still alive or not. They moved, but then the water swayed from his gate, and pondweed would have moved just the same. "Peace be upon you, grandfather." Zeyd stooped to greet his silent housemate by touching a respectful hand to the stone slab under which the saint lay. The inscription with which it was covered had once been gilded, but other hands than his had worn the gold away, taking it home on a million pious fingertips. What they had not taken was the feather. Set into the stone deep under a massive slab of rock crystal that bent the light as if one was looking into a stream, a feather longer than Zeyd's forearm blushed an astonishing rosy pink. If that was one of Gabriel's wing feathers, the full spread must be lovely indeed. Zeyd often imagined the wings as shading from crimson to gold, a particularly spectacular sunset. He was only a humble guardian of the tomb and the relic. He was neither particularly orthodox nor pious, and did not deserve that the angel who had once appeared to the saint should ever appear to him. But sometimes he wished. It was hard to be thought of as a holy man, and to make a living providing magical aid to anyone who asked, and still to have no proof, no conviction that any of it really existed. Setting doubt aside again, he moved the bags that lined the wall to make space for the bucket. Those who were too poor to have any roof at all over their head brought their few precious possessions to him when they had need of storing them. He kept them safe in a place from which no man would steal on peril of his soul, and labelled them so that he knew which to give back and to whom. Sometimes, when they had food to spare, or even coin, they paid him for the privilege. Other times they did not, and that was fine too. Like the baker, he was as generous as he could be with the resources he possessed. Knocking first, he ducked into the harem to deliver the biscuits to his mother and aunt, and then, determined to make good use of the last hour of light, brought his writing equipment and an unfinished magic diagram out of the cupboards of his office into the broader flood of light through the main room's door. This was a charm against malaria, a square of paper filled with numbers and sigils, with the names of angels and an invocation of divine mercy. When it was done, it would be rolled up and placed inside a large cylindrical bead that could be worn around the neck or hung up at the street door of a house to keep the illness away. It was, therefore, small and intricate work. Between consulting 3 different books and his father's notes to be sure he got it right, and struggling with his own involuntary muscle spasms to try and make the shapes as smooth and powerful as he could, he had no attention to spare for anything else. He was only aware of his visitors when their shadows fell across the page and almost made him smudge the ink. Then he looked up, with a headache lurking behind his eyes, and registered the high white slopes of janissary headdresses, beneath which the soldiers looked equally knife-bladed, fierce-eyed, and ready to die. 2 of them. They stepped to one side and allowed the third man to come forward, though man was a misnomer. Gorgeously clad in silk, the iridescent blue of peacock feathers, the young person was of indeterminate gender, smooth-faced and decked in bracelets, ears decorated with pearls, with a softness of fat about the face and figure that lent a feminine sleekness. Bright, beautiful eyes took in Zeyd's reaction and seemed to find it amusing. "Zeyd Ibn Rahman, you are the custodian of this shrine, the student of magic?" "I am." Zeyd scrambled up and wished he had kept back some of the biscuits to offer. He made a fruitless little gesture toward the stone jar of water that leaned against the further wall. "May I offer you some water? It is a long way up here, I know." "I think we'll dispense with the pleasantries." The eunuch's smile was mischievous. He clearly enjoyed terrifying unimportant holymen with unexpected troops. "If you need to find a coat, go get one now. We are to take you to the palace at once." Zeyd thought he should be honoured, but found he only had room for fear. What had he done that anyone in the palace might have taken note of? Had he overstepped some boundary? Did they, mercy of heaven, did someone tell them that he had spoken to the officer on the British ship before it opened fire? Was he to be blamed for that? The eunuch put a hand over his mouth to muffle the sound of his laughter. "I should tell someone about that guilty conscience of yours," he said, "but I won't. I am Daoud, servant to the Grand Mufti. You can question me all you like about what this is about, for my answer will be the same. I have not been told myself." He cast an interested eye over Zeyd's accommodation, the bundles of other people's clothes, the sad little table from which all the ivory had long disappeared. "But I don't think they would have sent me to arrest a dangerous criminal. I rather think I'm not supposed to represent a threat." Slightly reassured, Zeyd yelled through the harem screen to tell his women he would be venturing out again. Shed, jacket and kaftan, just long enough to add a waistcoat to the ensemble, and then rewound his sash over all and tightened his turban. While he did this, the soldiers merely glared at him, the way ibises glare at teeming fish, conscious that they were a higher form of life than he. But Daoud inclined his head a little, as if to say, "It will do. Follow me then, please." Back down to the harbour, unburdened this time except by worry, and into a private caique, rowed by 16 burly men in matching clothes, with hats whose colours he could not quite tell in the tricky evening light. The splendour of the palace, the courtyards filled with running water and trees and all the flowers of paradise, failed to calm him. He told himself that at least he was not being taken to the Fortress of 7 Towers. It didn't help much. That might come next. Inside they walked through pavilions and gilded gateways, past knots of men waiting for audiences with this official or that. Smaller rooms at first, then larger. Standing queues of petitioners gave way to divans where groups of men sat in glorious clothes and debated in lowered tones. The walls, covered with texts from the Quran, exhorted him to honesty and charity, obedience and bravery. He straightened his back in response. Daoud and the soldier slaves who followed him had all given their lives already. The years they had to walk and talk were only on loan from their master. If asked to give up their lives, they would do so with a dignified smile. Surely Zeyd could do the same. He was ignorant of wrong, after all. Only paradise awaited him on the other side of the garrote. Instead of a prison, they brought him out to a pavilion, which opened onto a modest garden brilliant with the blooms of tulips of every colour. There 12 people before him bowed and drew away, and left him awkwardly standing over Grand Mufti Haji Nabi bin Arban, prevented from falling to prostrate himself by Dowd's sudden, unexpectedly strong grip on his elbow. Dowd had to physically drag him to a cushion and settle him there, while Haji Nabi watched him with such a perfection of indifference he might have been asleep but for his open eyes. Slightly well-dressed eunuchs brought tea, which Zeyd clutched at, thankful for something to hold. And then, as if there had been a gesture too slight for Zeyd to see it, all of them withdrew at once, ushering other petitioners out before him. Zeyd was left completely alone in the Mufti's presence, and the knowledge that this truly was an unprecedented honour robbed him of his breath again. Well known by sight throughout the city, Haji Nabi combined an open-handed generosity with his fortune, endowing schools and libraries, bathhouses and hospitals for all, with small acts of kindness to the common man that had made him one of Istanbul's most beloved officials. Though Zeyd dwelt in a holy man's house, it was not so awe-inspiring or terrifying as sitting down to talk with a man the city regarded as a living saint. Dede Abdul made very few demands of his tenants. Haji Nabi did not point out that Zeyd looked like a frightened gazelle. He simply took a very long, deep breath and, leaning forward, murmured, "You are the magician?" "Theoretical magician, Holy One," Zeyd insisted. "I study the arts of Atlantis and draw up charts to do small things. I am not one who can speak with the jinn and the angels. I am just a scholar of these matters. But you would know if someone were under the influence of the evil eye. There are tests for evil influence which you could perform." Zeyd knew there were references to such practices in his father's books. "I would have to have access to my research," he said. He undertook a brief internal debate as he weighed how much he wanted to look foolish in front of the highest spiritual authority in the land, against how much he honestly wanted to be of help. "And possibly I would need my mother's assistance." "Your mother?" The Grand Mufti sounded genuinely interested, rather than contemptuous. "She has more actual power than I do. With my guidance she can do great things, as Fatima herself did. You are wise not to discount any of those to whom Allah's blessings are given." Haji Nabi flicked his prayer beads one by one through his palm, nudging them along with his thumb, while he watched lanterns kindle in distant windows, filling the evening with golden stars. He sighed, and Zeyd wondered with a little curl of dread whose health could possibly be important enough for the Grand Mufti to concern himself directly. "I have spoken to the Imam of your lodge. The Bektashi Dervish order is in good standing with me, and I have no doubt of its loyalty as a whole. Your own lodge-mates vouch for your integrity, but you must understand." Haji Nabi took out a square of cloth and wiped his face and hands, as if purifying himself for prayer. "I think I need to threaten you regardless. If you let one word slip of what I am about to show you, your death, and the deaths of your household, your respected mother and her sister, will not be quick. It will be a matter of treason, approaching blasphemy." Zeyd felt his hands and feet go cold. His tongue seemed to swell in his suddenly dried mouth. There must be someone other than me you can ask. Someone more important. All the important people are already playing games, said the Grand Mufti, with a wintry smile. Games which mean I cannot rely on them to give me an honest opinion. I am therefore relying on you. Do not let me down. I will. Zeyd swallowed the last of his tea, which had gone as bitter as his stomach. I will do all that I could possibly do. And that is all I ask. Come then. He led Zeyd in person, rising and disappearing into the walls like a mouse into a hole. Zeyd gasped in surprise. Before coming closer, he saw the concealed entrance of a narrow passage behind the pillar he had thought was mere ornament. Squeezing into a claustrophobic space, he followed it through the walls of the palace. They passed many grates and a few doors, going down 2 steep flights of steps before pausing behind a pierced-work image of a wide-lipped vase full of chrysanthemums, through which an oil lamp golden glow guttered. Each room they half glimpsed through the walls had been richer than the last. This was the most opulent of them all. Tables and bookstands sheathed in precious gems, carpets as pure in colour as the stones scattered on the floor, tapestries and embroideries folded around precious objects, or hung on the walls wherever there was a slight break from stained glass and gilded stone stars. A man sat in it alone, a stout gentleman with a carefully dressed moustache and beard, who muttered under his breath as he fiddled with a nargileh of solid gold with a jade mouthpiece. Zeyd realised what he was seeing too late and tried to prostrate himself. The width of the passage was too slender to allow it. All he could manage was an awkward bow. Haji Nabi raised an eyebrow at him, as if to say, "Well?" "I can't tell just like that," Zeyd whispered. "I need to go home, prepare a charm, look up the correct formula in my books." "I will have 100 angels!" the man screamed suddenly at the ceiling. "I will go forth accompanied by saints. I will have carpets and jinni. Where are my holy men? Where are my magicians? I will have them pour fire on my enemies. Teach them not to insult me with flame." Oh. Zeyd tried to take a step back, and failed in that too. But his slipper brushed along the wall with a thud, scarcely louder than his words, and Sultan Mahmud looked up at the wall behind which they were standing. Zeyd felt, indeed, as though the Sultan's white-rimmed eyes were looking directly at him. He tried again to fall to his knees, a cold sweat of terror blooming along his black backbone, but again Haji Nabi caught his arm and prevented him. "Nabi, I can tell you're there, prying and peeking as always. Come out, or I will send the tigers in for you. Big cats in the walls, that will put an end to some of the spying." The Sultan was still laughing to himself at the thought, when Nabi jammed his fingers into a crack in the wall that Zeyd thought little wider than a fingernail. It hinged back and revealed a handle that, when pulled upon, allowed the entire section of wall to slide aside, and Nabi to step out into the Sultan's private rooms as if he had meant it all along. This time Zeyd was permitted the prostration. He fell to his hands and knees with some relief, and felt Nabi fold himself gracefully into the same posture beside him. Silence for a long while, and the Sultan paced around them both, his gaze like lead weights on Zeyd's back. "What is this?" "You asked for holy men, Padishah." Nabi's voice was scarcely recognisable as his own, so much more melodious, soothing, reassuring. "This is Zeyd ibn Rahman, who keeps the shrine of Dede Abul Khalik, and is a well-known magician in the Aop quarter. I was not sure if you wanted the other members of the divan to know you sought magicians for the war, so I brought him in by private ways. And if I had not heard you scrabbling in the walls like rats—" Nabi's jovial laugh approved of a joke the Sultan had almost certainly not made. "I was about to knock, as you called, exalted." The feet circumnavigated Zeyd again. Zeyd raised his head just a little to watch them, dazzling slippers on dazzling carpets, more than he ever wanted to see of the inside of the palace. "Zeyd ibn Rahman, a great future is before you," the Sultan began, a strange quality to his voice, as though he had caught the cadence of the marketplace storytellers, thought he could shape the world simply by narrating it, though that was not so strange. He could. He could simply speak and make it so. Nothing stood between his will and the physical exertion of it. In that way he was far more of a mage than Zeyd even pretended to be. "I wish to equip my heaviest artillery units with the means to travel swiftly without the needs for supply trains, to let them swoop down on enemy slitties from the sky. You will bring me 100 flying carpets, each one 100 ayak long and sturdy enough to carry 30 cannons aside with their crews and ammunition." Zeyd imagined it with a blink of surprise. Mad the Sultan might be, but creative with it. Think what a fleet of such things could do. Only after he had seen the destructive glory of the idea did he remember that his own powers amounted only to the ability to write neatly in very small spaces. He could not do this thing. He'd never been gladder to be crouched on the floor, for his limbs seemed to have dissolved beneath him. He knew now how the jellyfish had felt when lifted from the comforting ocean. His own reek of terror stung his nose and completed his humiliation. To come before the Sultan and stink at him. He scrambled after his wits. "Highest and most exalted lord, the art of making flying carpets is forgotten. Has been forgotten since before the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. I don't—" "Then you will reinvent it." A sound of warmth, as though the king of all the earth had smiled above his head, and then the Sultan said, "Up, up, and see what I have already achieved." Silently, Zeyd allowed Nabi to help him to his feet, guide him like a blind man in the wake of the Sultan's departing heels. The floor narrowed and widened, and then there were stairs down and chained doors that had to be opened by genuflecting eunuch guards. If Zeyd had thought his own stench offensive, it was nothing to the miasma that greeted him in the lowest chambers. The carpets underfoot were soggy with warm red liquid. Satin cushions fine enough for a prince, little tables and boxes that had once been polished, were now browning and stuck with flies, flecked with small pieces of meat and sinew. A blood clot the size of a fist wobbled by Zeyd's foot, black, until the vibrations of his footsteps stirred it. It slid away on a crimson trail. Nabi's hands were cutting off the circulation in his arm, digging in and bruising. He could hear the older man's breath speeding, and then slowing again as he forced himself to calm. Zeyd himself didn't believe he was breathing at all. The first of my angels. The beautiful slippers reached a dais, stepped up, and Zeyd didn't need to raise his eyes to see the thing that had once been a man laid out there in the deepest pool of blood. It had been hollowed out like a calf at the butcher's, internal organs removed, genitalia removed and placed in the right hand. By the look on its face, this had happened while he was alive. Oddly shaped leathery wings spread out from the back, and when Zeyd got closer he could see they were made of the skin from the man's torso, stretched over a frame of brass. The Sultan knelt with a squelch, and tried to smooth some of the lines of inhuman agony from the victim's face. "Why should my brothers live in captivity, when they might head my armies as avenging angels? It is more fitting for the sons of Osman to fly as warriors than to rot in a cage." Allah the Merciful. Zeyd swallowed, and swallowed again as his stomach threatened to heave. One does not throw up on the Sultan's brother, however brutalized. Panic turned into a hard ball of iron in his mouth. He would say anything, anything, to get out of here, and then perhaps kill himself more cleanly once he had the chance. "Winged armies," he gasped, with a voice that trembled so fast it was almost steady. "Astounding, yes?" "Yes, Exalted One. Nothing I had ever imagined." "So you will bring me carpets tomorrow." More flies arrived with every movement. The air was itchy with their drone. The floor seemed to move with the squirming of their black backs. Zeyd wobbled on his feet. Unobtrusively, Nabi dug his fingers in further and shook him back to clarity. I will require some time and the help of other magicians, Lord. This cannot be done with the mundane carpets bought in the souk. They will have to be woven for the purpose." Nabi made a placatory gesture with one hand, his voice unbelievably just as smooth and reasonable as ever. "That accords with what I read, Padishah. The magic has to be woven in from the start." A longer pause. Zeyd struggled not to faint, struggled not to look up, to try impiously to read the Sultan's face. Then a sigh. 3 weeks. I will have converted my remaining brothers by then, and sent a message to the English that, stupid as they are, they will not be able to misinterpret. My lord, it will take months for the armies to muster, especially those that have come from the tribute provinces. There is yet time to do this properly. Nabi was trying to buy him some time to leave the country, Zeyd realized, with a little sliver of gratitude. The Grand Mufti did not disappoint in person, as brave and as kind as rumour painted him. I will see progress in 3 weeks, or I will have you both executed as the spies you are. Favoured of God, our lives belong to you already, and all we desire is to serve you. Nabi prostrated himself on the wet floor, tugging Zeyd down with him. A moment later they were hauled to their feet and marched out by 2 Beylik guards. Do you still need to return home for your books? Ajnabi smiled a brittle smile as he gestured for Daud to pour them both tea. They had been deposited in one of the small courtyards between walls where prisoners were kept before execution. No attempt had been made to keep them there, and they had made their way back to Nabi's apartments unencumbered. But it served as a gentle reminder of how easy it was to disappear should they fail. Daud had caught their mood and changed into an outfit as soft grey-pink as the breast of a dove. He took away the basins of water and towels with which they had cleansed themselves, took away their stained clothes, and having finished helping them into new ones, offered tea. Zeyd's mind was flying into every corner, trying to escape what he had just seen. He sipped at the cleansing bitterness of mint tea and attempted to convince himself it was washing away the smell of blood. I cannot doubt that he is under an evil influence. Have you tried the lead pourers? That is surely nothing but a woman's superstition. Nabi took a soothing breath of smoke and looked at him as though he was a deep and personal disappointment, a last hope that hadn't paid off. At least Zeyd did not worry about insulting the Grand Mufti. There was little he could do to make his situation worse. In our experience, it's a very powerful ritual, he said. If we could draw the influence from him and imprison it in hot lead, we could even make bullets from the lead and use it to transfer the evil into our enemy. You are not telling me that actually works, Nabi repeated, and when Zeyd opened his mouth to do so, he waved his hand impatiently, cutting him off. Even if it did, do you think the Sultan, may he live forever, would allow a couple of old crones to pour lead above him while he slept? Or do you think you could smuggle them past the Janissaries and the white eunuchs and the black eunuchs, not to mention his concubines and wives, to reach him once he has retired for the night? He won't agree to it. Of course not. He doesn't believe there is anything wrong with him. The influence protects itself. We must be subtler. Zeyd scrubbed at his face with his fingertips. He had been assured he was clean, but he felt spatters of cool, tacky liquid in his hair nevertheless. I may have misled you, Excellence, but I don't know what I can do. I am a scholar of magic, not a practitioner. Your charms don't require their maker to have any power. It is the letters and the shapes themselves that have an effect. You could copy them out and they would be every bit as good, probably more so. I've never really had any success. My father did, and my mother did. They felt sure it should come out in me, but no, nothing. His fingernails felt scrubbed and sore. His hands smelled of jasmine from the oil he had worked into them after washing. Haji Nabi's cast-off clothes were grander by far than anything he'd worn in his life, and he felt like a boy playing at heroes who is suddenly expected to be ridiculously brave in real life. The Grand Mufti gave a thin, exasperated laugh. Then that will be the first thing you have to do if you wish to bring the Sultan his carpets within the next 3 weeks. Acquire the power somehow. I can't just become a mage, just for the asking. Haji Nabi got up and motioned for him to follow again, bringing him out of the palace and down into the closest street of clerks. There a small cupboard of an office had been squeezed in underneath stone steps, which led to the guild house of the tailors. Just a box of a room, with a low stone table, a few shelves around the walls, and a shutter which closed off the narrow entrance when the room was not in use. It smelled of mice, and a thin cat curled around Zeyd's ankles when he tried to go inside. It is the Sultan's will that you bring him magic carpets, said Nabi, passing Zeyd a document with his seal on it, which told its reader that Zeyd was acting under the Grand Mufti's authority. He watched Zeyd explore the dim little space with an eye of serene composure. Thus, I do what I can to make it possible. If you cannot create the carpets yourselves, I commission you to find the mages who can. I give you these premises from which to operate. When you have recruits, you will send them to me, and I will pay their salaries. I will provide you with any supplies that are required, and you may call upon my authority at will to back you in whatever else you need to make this enterprise succeed. You will bring the Sultan his carpets, and you will bring him a cure for his malady. Is that not so? I'm not sure. Zeyd looked around the small, asymmetrical space. Put in charge of Istanbul's magicians? Made, in effect, if not name, Istanbul's archmage? It would have been an enormous honour if it hadn't also been a trap. The jar of heaven beneath Hagia Sophia was smashed to pieces when Mehmed II conquered the city. Though we are at the edge of the influence of the one in Greece, that too has been broken for 500 years. Nabi gave him that look again, the one that says, "Woe is me, for this is the best I have to work with." What does that mean? It means that it's unlikely we'll find anyone in Istanbul with powers strong enough to do what the Sultan demands. Nabi stroked his bottom lip with his thumb, as though, had he been 40 years younger, he would have sucked it. Well, I suggest you try. Success is Allah's hands, but without it I think you can imagine what might happen. Zeyd could not stop imagining it. When Nabi returned to the palace, Zeyd strode to the town criers' guild. There he commissioned a notice to be read out on street corners, offering employment to those who would prove their magical powers. Having set a time for tomorrow and a meeting place of his new office, he went home. In comparison with the gore-filled scene of the Kafers, the tombs seemed cheery. He thought about his own grave, composed himself a small epitaph to be carved on his headstone. It was almost a comforting thought, until he ducked within the screen that shielded his arm from the outer world. A scent of lamb and couscous greeted him, and his mother and aunt paused in their work, one stirring the pot over the clay brazier, the other bringing plates out of their wrappings by the wall, to smile at him. Then he remembered that there was no other male relative to whom he could entrust their care. If he died, what would become of them? Would the city still come to buy charms if the seller was a woman? Well, perhaps they would. But Zeyd didn't like the idea of either elderly lady having to deal with the outside world, with strange men of all sorts, all by themselves. Mother, Auntie. He folded himself down to sit on the cushions they had piled by the far wall. I have a great deal to tell you, but it may make you worry. Would you rather be in glad ignorance or in knowledge? They served the food and came to sit by him. His mother reached out a hand to pat his knee. She had once been very beautiful. To him she still was. But the bones of that beauty could no longer quite support her aged skin. Life had rumpled it and added a yellow tint to the whites of her eyes. But their gaze was as direct and amused as ever. I see it has made you afraid. Tell us everything. Then Jala and I can take over the worrying while you act. So Zeyd told them everything. It was helpful to share the anxiety, to talk of hope. You'll see, said his mother, determinedly positive. Tomorrow Allah will send you a prince among mages. Or the day after that. It had something of the same sweetness with which he'd lied to him as a boy, telling him that the pain of circumcision would be over in a moment and forgotten. He remembered it still, but he appreciated the bolstering nevertheless. The morning came strangely cold, and chilly breezes straight off the Black Sea whipped through the streets of Eyüpbara. Zeyd dodged through a line of donkeys laden with firewood, and was almost kicked by the one ahead of him, the beasts nervous at the uncertain weather. Their drivers nodded apologies to him, but he returned absent-mindedly as he came to his booth and found a queue outside it. Opening the shutters, he studied the line of potential mages surreptitiously through his lashes. He was not entirely sure what a great magician ought to look like, but surely not like a Nigerian camel driver, fiddling with his goad and flinching whenever anyone looked at him. A little further down the line, a Jewish doctor looked more likely, wearing holy texts bound on his forehead and upper arm, and a necklace of Hebrew words and letters punched into 2 sheets of silver. At the end of the queue there were even 2 women, heavily and modestly veiled. He thought they must at least be very certain of their skills, and brazen as an idol with it, to come out here and try and take a man's job. Under the expectant gazes of nearly 20 people, he wished he'd brought a larger cushion, and the more impressive of his writing sets. But such as it was, he spread paper, inkwell, and pen box around him, balanced a blank book on his lap, and prepared to take names, histories, and details of amazing powers. The line dwindled over the morning. Mostly astrologers. One, astounding master of fire, proved to have invented a system of delivering black powder to his palms and kindling it with flints embedded in his fingernails. For a while, Zeyd was willing to believe that, if the fire was no mystery, still there must be something miraculous in hands that did not burn. But then the man confessed he had spent months building up such thick calluses he no longer felt the brief flash of flame. Impressive as a street entertainment, he had to rule in the end, but not what this guild is looking for. By midday prayers, there were only 6 people left. Of these 6, 2 claimed the ability to speak to the spirits of the dead, but as neither was able to prove it, Zeyd dismissed them both. The Jew, Ibrahim, turned out to be an older counterpart of himself, learned in texts and formulas, steeped in the Kabbalah, but he too was a scholar and no practitioner. Zeyd retained him anyway. He would not help to make carpets, but it was only prudent for the Empire's long-term future in this newly magical world to gather for it all the expert knowledge he could get. "What do you do?" he asked the camel herder, a tall and slender man, very black of skin, in a billowing cloak that reminded Zeyd sickeningly of wings of skin. "I am very good with camels, Effendi." The man had stood in line all morning as the winds dropped and the sun climbed higher. Now the street was the approximate temperature of a clay oven, and still he stood patiently, waiting to sign on with the wrong guild. "I am looking for magi, not animal trainers." "I know this. I am very good with camels. Bring me one, and I'll show you." "You couldn't have brought your own?" The herdsman grinned. "Then you would say that I had trained it." That being true, Zeyd sent one of the small boys who sat in the shade and watched them, one of the boys who surely should have been in school, to fetch him a camel, and watched in astonishment as the herdsman made it dance with whispered commands. He entered the man's name, Suleiman bin Dada, and details into the records. Not sure to what good he could put the talent, but grateful to have discovered anything at all. A black Egyptian named Adam bin Adil was his 3rd recruit. Adam sat on the ground before Zeyd and made the sand leap up and form itself into tiny models of the ancient temples of his own people. Only an ayak or so in size, small enough to be easily held between his hands, but exquisitely detailed and populated by fingernail-sized people who walked and shopped and gossiped better than any puppet Zeyd had ever seen. After finding a true talent in 2 foreigners, he was not surprised that his 3rd recruit with genuine magical ability was one of the women, a slave originally from France, captured on the sea, bought and eventually married by a maker of gold jewellery. Monique bint Mercies claimed an ability to find any small thing that had been lost, and proved it by telling 3 of the onlookers where they could find their keys, sarpesh, and a sequin embedded in the heel of a shoe. She was the last. Zeyd felt satisfied on an intellectual level. It was just as he had said to Haji Nabi. The people who had a gift were none of them from Istanbul itself. Each had grown up within the range of one of the jars of heaven. Clearly, the devices not only provided the raw power for magic, but also worked on the bodies of children raised near them to enable them to use it. From a standpoint of theory, the fact that his mages all originated outside the city was further confirmation his understanding was correct, and he was enough of a scholar to be pleased at that. From a practical point of view, however, he had spent a whole day of his 3 weeks and gained nothing. Torture so terrifying he could not bear to contemplate it loomed in his future if he failed. But what a camel whisperer, a sand sculptor, and a finder of lost keys could do to build him flying battle platforms, he could not begin to think. A clean death at his own hand might be the best option. He bought poison on the way home. Thanks for listening. That was Sons of Devils, Chapter 2, read by Gallad here. The music was Gifts of Stars by Lloyd Rogers, used with thanks, and with attribution from Pixabay.